everybody. And my guest is Dave Workman. He is the editor of Gun Mag, a publication of the Second Amendment Foundation. I just want to apologize for the construction noise in the background. There's a lot going on here. But Dave, thanks for joining me today.
Well, my pleasure, Chuck. It almost sounds like my neighborhood out in Washington State. We had a big storm
out there.
Oh, got a big storm over the weekend. Trees down, power out.
Oh, okay. Well, that can happen here in Boston too. We get that. Boston, you can never tell with the weather.
Yeah.
So, Dave, you're a longtime advocate of the Second Amendment rights and right to keep and bear arms, which is something that I concur with. But at the same time, I have trouble understanding some things, and I don't know. Maybe you can help me clear them up.
Sure.
I understand the concept of that the right to keep and bear arms is a basic function of freedom. It's part of our Constitution for a reason. We want to check and balance the power of government. We want to protect ourselves and our families. There's all of those factors that went into play. I mean, it should be noted, even during the Civil War at Appomattox, the reason why General Lee and General Grant came to an agreement and signed the armistice was because General Grant allowed Lee and his men to go back to their farm with their firearms, and it was very specifically stated at the time as a condition for the surrender. So it's an intrinsic part of who we are as a people. But at the same time, I have trouble getting my head around the idea of people having semi-automatic weapons. I mean, like AR-15s that are used to shoot schools. I mean, is that something that should be regulated? And if so, how can we regulate it in such a way that legitimate people can have them? And why would somebody want to have one of those?
Well, let's keep things in perspective. We can't put a limit on the advances of technology. Otherwise, we'd all still be riding horses and using quill pens and old type presses to put out newspapers. There wouldn't be an internet. Women wouldn't have the vote. All of that we have to consider. Now, the AR-15 is a semi-automatic firearm. It has been mischaracterized as an assault weapon simply because of its appearance. And frankly, I think that there are millions of those in circulation now, and the people who misuse them amount to a small percentage or even a fraction of a percent of the number of people who actually own those guns. And one way to control the problem is to, certainly punish the people who misuse them and leave the honest people alone. If somebody wants to own an AR-15, big deal. If he's behaving himself with it, if he's using it for legitimate reasons, for varmint hunting, for competition, to protect his home, just leave him alone.
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't know if I agree with you that because something is invented and because we have progress, we can't regulate it. I mean, we have regulation against things like cloning, and all sorts of things.
Well, show me where cloning is mentioned in the Constitution.
Right, but the point is that gun control, so I guess the question is how far can you take it? Can somebody have a we are going to have some regulation. I mean, I think that's a given. I don't disagree with you necessarily on the AR-15, only that I guess that as someone who comes from the the fancy pants East, I don't know. I mean, I guess sort of a striped shirt, striped pants type in a way. I mean, even though I consider myself to be a conservative, I'm in a culture here which has influenced me. What does someone do with an AR-15? I mean, why are there a million of them? I mean, who uses them and why?
Well, there's more like 12 to 15 million of them in circulation. I think that's a conservative estimate. People use AR-15s for any number. Excuse me?
No, I'm listening.
Sorry
about the noise in the background.
No, it's okay. Okay. People use them for any number of different things. As I mentioned before, they compete with them. They use them for home protection. They use them for hunting, varmints, coyotes. They use them for predator control. There's all kinds of reasons for a person to want to have one of those, and in case there's a social breakdown, that's going to be a firearm that people are going to use and to protect their homes and even maybe their neighborhoods. Because as we've seen many times in the past, in a situation where law enforcement can't respond to an emergency, you're really on your own. You're the first responder. And what better type of firearm to have than a semi-automatic rifle that is certainly available. It's easy to maintain. It's easy to use. Women can use it. Kids can learn to shoot with them. As I say, there's all kinds of reason for it.
Very good. Okay, and I understand the political ramifications of a disarmed population. I mean, we could take a look at how in Weimar Germany the government disarmed the country under the name of safety as a way of stopping the violence that was occurring in the streets between the Nazis and the communists. And as a result, once the Nazis came to power, they didn't have to worry about kicking someone's door down because they knew that the person on the other side of the door didn't have a gun. So, obviously this is a value. I mean, I interviewed a guy who was in the resistance in Poland during the war, and he said that the two things that they didn't have enough of was food and guns. And they were out fighting the Nazis and shooting them and liberating concentration camps and trying to kill Nazi soldiers. And they would have been better off. I mean, the Nazis probably wouldn't have really come to power in a way if the people had been properly armed. They wouldn't have gotten away with that kind of a totalitarian system. So I understand that from a political standpoint, and I support that right. That is a very basic human right, the idea of protecting yourself, and it is a natural counterbalance to government power and its increase. There couldn't be a better one. But is there any form, how should, I suppose, to get back to my old Eastern Seaboard hat here, how do we regulate firearms in this country in a way that protects Second Amendment, but at the same time make sure that the people who have them know how to use them properly and are the right people to have them?
Well, let's take this one at a time. First, government-mandated training programs are a bad idea because that's when the government starts regulating it in a way that eventually nobody's going to be able to take the training or pass the training. I certainly am supportive of voluntary training of firearms. I think it might be a good idea to begin firearms training as a public school course. They're trying this in a couple of states right now, and that's a good idea because I think it's going to prevent a lot of firearms accidents. The hunter education program that started back in 1949 in New York with the support and assistance of the National Rifle Association, that has helped, I think, reduce a lot of firearms accidents, especially among younger people who take that course.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I'm with you on that. In fact, I think that up until the 1940s, most high schools did have some firearms training. Right here in Boston Latin School had military training. It was an all-boys school up until the 60s, but they actually had militia training in the backgrounds of the school, and every student had to do it.
Yeah, I also remember, when I was going to junior high school out here in Washington State, which is probably 100 years ago, mm-hmm. And in high school, our schools had rifle teams, and those kids who participated in that got a real healthy dose of firearms safety education before they ever pulled a trigger, and and that worked out, I think, pretty good. There are other ways to regulate firearms too. For example, locking people up who misuse firearms instead of using that as a bargaining chip for to cop a plea to some of their crime. If somebody misuses a firearm, if they deliberately hurt somebody or rob somebody, lock them up. That should be non-negotiable. If you're going to misuse a firearm in a crime, you got to go to jail for that. And that might be a deterrent factor too. Another thing, instead of disarming the law-abiding citizens with too much red tape, make it easier for law-abiding citizens to have firearms back in the East Coast, back where you're at right now. Offer training programs around the state, in your townships. Make sure that the chiefs of police aren't so stingy with those gun permits, because an armed society, as has been said many times, is a polite society.
No, I mean, again, you're making very, very good points here, and that you know the hard part of gun control is the hard part that our government doesn't want to do, which is to disarm criminals. You know, you have the city of Chicago, which has the most strict gun control laws in the country, and yet it's also the murder capital of the country. I mean, real gun control would be to go into the areas where people are shooting people and to take them out. I mean, I'm not, you know, I recognize that's an extremely difficult task, and I think President Trump has already done a pretty good job of that, getting started in terms of taking out the MS-15 gangs and here in New York and in other places. And that's really where you need real gun control, you know, and the liberals don't want to talk about that. I mean, here in Massachusetts, they have the Bartley-Fox law, which is that anyone who uses a gun in the commission of a crime has a mandatory 1-year jail sentence. But the problem is that they've never really enforced it here. So, you know, that's real gun control. I mean, and I think that that's what you're alluding to.
Yeah, I think you just cracked the code there. You've got this gun law on the books back there, and it's been on the books for a while. Yeah. They don't enforce it. So, you know, the criminals are going to look at that and they say, oh, yeah, big deal. Who are we going to rob tonight? And that's essentially what's going on now. Out here in the West, in Washington State, where I live right now, voters, I think, mistakenly passed an initiative here in November that makes every semi-automatic rifle in the state of Washington a semi-automatic assault rifle. And that goes for the 22 that I own, for the 22s that my neighbors own. I don't own an AR-15. I never have. I've shot a lot of them. I think they're a lot of fun to shoot. Some of them are remarkably accurate, but they just never got my juices flowing, I guess. And if my neighbor had a house full of those things, I wouldn't care, because my neighbor's a stand-up guy. He's an honest citizen. He hasn't hurt anybody. The idea that adding more layers of red tape, more obstacles for a law-abiding citizen to exercise his or her constitutionally guaranteed right is going to reduce crime is nonsense, and it borders on the delusional.
No, I mean, I hear you. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the phenomena, of course, of the school shootings. And that's something that, you know, people blame the gun. It's not the gun, because guns used to be more available back in the day. I mean, I remember back in the, I'm old enough to remember when you could buy a gun over the counter at Woolworths.
Yep.
You know, you just showed your ID and you could buy the gun. There wasn't even a background check at all. So people generally had guns much more accessible than they do now, and yet now we have this phenomena where people are going into schools and murdering people and committing mass murder. So you can't blame the gun. You have to take a look at what's going on with our schools and with people that have, you know, decide that they can do this and do it. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, why is this happening, and how can we protect the children in our schools?
Well, I think there are several different contributing factors to this. First, we've had what a lot of people who are friends of mine who've been in education, retired teachers, understand. There's been a breakdown of discipline in schools. You can't punish anybody anymore. You can't hold these kids accountable for stuff, and that's part of the problem. Another thing, remember, I mentioned that when I was going to junior and senior high schools, we had rifle teams in both of those schools. Nobody ever got shot. Nobody suffered a scratch. And those kids would bring rifles to school on Thursday or Friday, whenever it was that they had their range days. And that's certainly something that should not have changed. People, we have a society where there are a lot of firearms, and kids need to understand gun safety regulations, but the breakdown of communications, the breakdown of discipline, and maybe it's one-parent families too. I've read some stuff about that. I don't know that I agree with it, but these people believe in what they're writing, and they've done some research about it. I'm not an educator, but I do know this. The commission actually that was created in the aftermath of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida last year, included several law enforcement professionals. They have come up with several recommendations, and one of those is to have a program that allows volunteer teachers to be armed on campus. I know that down in Mississippi, there was a vice principal named Joel Myrick who interrupted a school shooter down there because he just happened to have a .45 automatic in his truck parked out in the school parking lot. Mm-hmm. He went to get that gun, and after the shooter in that case had shot a couple of students, and he was trying to drive away, Myrick stopped him and held him at gunpoint until the sheriff got there. This is the sort of thing that I think the anti-gun crowd doesn't want to hear, because we need to remember that we rely on ourselves. We can be the first responders. When I was going to school, junior and senior high, and even in grade school, we had a lot of men instructors who'd been in the service. They'd been grown up with guns. They were hunters. They knew how firearms worked. Maybe some of that has gone away too. Let's try getting outside the box. We've boxed ourselves into a mindset that guns are bad. People shouldn't have them because they're not qualified to have them. Okay, well let's teach them how to use them. Let's provide the training. And if a teacher wants to volunteer, and remember, nobody's forcing a teacher to have a gun in his or her classroom. This is a voluntary program, and it's been in use now for a few years in other parts of the country. Teachers who have gone through the training and are armed on campus, or at least have the ability to be armed on campus, there really is nothing wrong with that. If they want to be the first responders, if they want to protect their kids in the event of an attack like happened in Florida last year, or in Maryland last year, or any number of other places, they ought to be able to do that. They ought to have the tools to do that.
No, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And putting aside the actual sociological cause of this, which is a question that's beyond, our scope today,
certainly higher than my pay grade.
But it's an issue. But we're here to talk about the practical answer to it, which is a well-armed citizenry that's trained and able to function with firearms. I mean, it makes you think of, for example, in the state of Israel in 1975, I think it was, they experimented with gun control, and a couple of people came across the border and held a nursery school hostage, killing 50 children. The response to that was that retired Israeli military personnel, police, security people, grandmothers and grandfathers in the case of Israel, because it's both men and women, were brought in, and they guarded the schools. These are people whose grandchildren were going to the school. who knew what they were doing, and they've been there doing it ever since. And these instances have virtually stopped as a result. So there is certainly nothing wrong with that. And obviously in this country, in response to the 9/11 attack, we have air marshals who are plainclothes. They don't know who they are. We have security guards at all sorts of facilities in this country. I mean, I know somebody went to a private school in Greater Boston. To get in the school, there was a guard with a gun. You could see it. It was open. You had to be, buzzed in, because that school felt that they had particular security questions. So it is perfectly normal, perfectly appropriate that a school take whatever measures they need to take based upon the perceived threat, and that threat and that perception could include people who know how to use guns and who are there. I know that this is going on in synagogues around the country, especially after the attack in Pittsburgh. It's going on in churches. We see people that are now going in who are plainclothes. The public doesn't know who they are, and who are ready to deal with any eventuality should have come up. So what you're talking about is just basic, normal common sense. And yet, when President Trump mentioned this very idea after the Parkland shooting, he was mocked. Now, maybe that's for political reasons. Anything he says is going to be mocked. But what is the mindset behind this? I mean, you've got these people, in Boston, certainly, and you've got, and it's not just a couple either. I mean, you got Michael Bloomberg, right? Financing some of these big gun-grabbing organizations and all their propaganda. What do they think? I mean, are they some kind of like fuzzy-headed utopians who think that if we get rid of firearms, we're all going to sit around a campfire and wiggle our toes? I mean, what's going on with that?
Well, first, I think you have to remember that Michael Bloomberg's got his own armed security.
Yes, exactly.
And for him to be talking about how foolish it is for average citizens to have a gun in their home or to want to carry a gun for personal protection, and him to look down his nose at that is just mind-numbing hypocrisy. And he's got no relevance to the real world that I can see. He does dump millions of dollars into efforts around the country, including the one in Washington State here, that have tried to restrict the rights of law-abiding firearms owners for the past several years, ever since he stopped being mayor in New York. Now, let's get beyond Michael Bloomberg. And you asked about the mindset of these people. I think maybe you're getting close when you're talking about fuzzy-headed utopians. It's not the firearm. A gun is just a tool. I know as a journalist, I've done stories about people who stabbed innocent people to death. In fact, mass stabbings. There was been a few in China. People use all kinds of different things to kill other people. Remember Nice, France, here a few years ago, where the terrorists stole a semi-truck and ran over, 85 people and killed them?
That's right. That's right. You can find ways.
And they will find ways to do that. Why not let the average citizen, and why not recognize the average citizen has the right to be on the same footing, to be on a level playing field? There are about 17.5 million people in the United States right now who are legally licensed to carry concealed handguns every day for their personal protection. Here in Washington State, we've got over 608,000 active concealed pistol licenses. And that's significant in a state that has been voting blue for the last several years, and has a population of about 7.5 million. Of the maybe 5 million adults who are of legal age to carry a handgun, about 10% of them are maybe 10% or better are licensed to carry. Now that tells me something. And what it says is that a lot of people don't listen to Michael Bloomberg, or they may talk about gun control, but gee, better for thee, but not for me. It's a mentality that I think we've got to cut through that and recognize that this is a right we're talking about, and that right is for everybody, not just the elitists, not just the wealthy, not just people who can afford to have armed security. It's a right that is reserved for every citizen who can exercise it.
It's very intrinsic, and I think that to go to your point, this is not a partisan issue. It's not a conservative liberal issue, because the state that has the highest per capita gun ownership in the United States, which means the number of guns per number of citizens, is Vermont. And
Yeah.
I mean, Bernie Sanders, Vermont. I mean, this is Howard Dean's Vermont. This is not, and they were very pro-gun. I mean, while they were at least at home, maybe not in the, it's like Ted Kennedy. He used to be, wanting to cut government and cut the military. But at home, he's made sure that we got a lot of money from the military. So I mean, you have to take a look at what they actually are doing in their own, where they have to get elected in their own states. And Vermont is very, very gun ownership oriented. So, when
And
people
Vermont's
say,
got a very low crime rate too, doesn't it?
well, yeah, I mean, well, of course they don't have any cities either, but, and they're all white. But putting that aside, look, the fact is that, this is not a partisan issue. This is not this is an issue of that runs across the board. It's an issue that's trying to address crime and criminal matters without in any way infringing on the inherent and constitutional right of the citizen to keep and bear arms.
Well, it's all. You mentioned something else that they're all white in Vermont. I tell you, white people kill each other too.
Oh yeah, and what I mean by that is that there are serious crime problems in some of the urban areas thanks to liberals and the way they've handled the racist policies they've implemented that have created crime, particularly in black neighborhoods. But that's another question. I've talked about that.
Well, and remember, the victims of those crimes are blacks
yeah,
too.
Exactly. And a lot of the problems there have to do with liberal policies going back to the '60s. But that's another show. The point I'm trying to make here is that the right to keep and bear arms, and by the way, those communities, you have people who more than ever need to know how to handle arms and protect themselves. The 98, 99% of people who live in black communities are trying to get to their jobs. They're trying to live their life. They're trying to function. And you have these thugs who are terrorizing them. And if anyone needs to protect themselves, it's them.
Well, yeah, and remember that the case that brought Chicago to its knees in terms of gun control was McDonald v. City of Chicago. Otis McDonald, the late Otis McDonald, he passed away a couple of years ago. He was just a sweet, gentle man. He was an African-American. He moved up to Chicago from the South when he was a kid. He is really one of these stories where he pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and became something of a success. He lived in a crummy neighborhood, and he simply wanted to have a gun in his home to protect his house. Sure. And I'm glad that you brought that perspective in. The people who live in those crime-ridden communities, they do deserve to have the right and to be able to exercise the right to defend themselves and their families. They can be, you can be crime victim no matter what color you are. You can be a criminal no matter what color you are. The thing about the liberal policies that you've mentioned a few times is that the people who come up with those policies don't seem to be able to tell the difference. And they'd rather go after the law-abiding citizen, I guess because it's easier, because they know that the law-abiding citizens will obey the law, whereas the criminal, he's going to disobey the law. He's going to ignore the law, and they know that.
And also, the people that are trying to disarm the black community are predominantly wealthy white liberals like Michael Bloomberg. Anyways, Dave Workman, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Please let my listeners and viewers know how they can reach you and how they can find out more information about you and your excellent work.
Well, that's very kind of you. I'm the senior editor of thegunmag.com. It used to be Gun Week. It's a publication owned by the Second Amendment Foundation. I also am the senior editor of Liberty Park Press, which is another publication that we produce here at Liberty Park in Bellevue, Washington. You can find it just by Googling up thegunmag.com or libertyparkpress.com. And also be sure and check with the Second Amendment Foundation. Google that up at saf.org, or the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, which is ccrkba.org.
All right, Dave Workman, again, thanks for joining me today. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, Chuck.
All right.